welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by the author of a fantasy book that captivated me this past weekend. It is such a beautifully written book, and the imagery is so gorgeous, and I am very excited to have him here. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yes, my name is Pechaček, and my book is The West Passage, a dark fantasy novel.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Could you talk a little bit about your journey to the book, how you got into writing, and sort of how this project came to be?
My mom read Lord of the Rings to us when we were very young, and I was like, okay, I bet I could do that. So I've just been scribbling away at things since I was a kid, and we finally got here. And this book itself came about because it must have been like some cold evening in winter of 2019. I was like, wouldn't it be so funny if there was a fantasy novel, an epic fantasy novel about somebody walking down a hallway? And obviously it didn't stay there, but that was the germ, and it was like it all just came from that almost claustrophobic seed of like gotta limit things as much as possible here. And then after a certain point I did start going, I'm tired of humans in this book. So I was like, I gotta find other things to be inspired by, and half of the characters in the book are literally pulled directly from Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights.
That is so cool. Yeah, I really love the medievalism of this book, but it's not really Tolkien's medievalism. And
No,
you grew up on Tolkien, as you just said, and you have a Tolkien podcast. Is that correct?
that is correct. By the Bywater.
Nice. Yeah, and it really accesses the weirder side of the Middle Ages, the bestiaries, the sort of the so-called monstrous races, and just the sort of weird, expansive view of what could exist in the world. So could you talk a little bit about your medieval sources? You mentioned Bosch. Like, were there other sort of texts or images that you were drawing on?
Sort of. The illustrations more were inspired by specific texts, like the two protagonists, Yarrow and Q, each have a different art style for their chapters. So Yarrow is very heavily inspired by things like the Book of Kells or the Gospel of Saint Chad, a real thing, and I love telling people about that. Like the very old sort of insular Celtic, ancient English type stuff, because she represents an older tradition of things in this setting. And then Q, who is a little more well-read, and cosmopolitan is absolutely the wrong word, but I don't know what else to say at the moment, has a more of an international Gothic, late 14th, heading into the 15th century thing going on. Especially in earlier chapters, there are specific illustrations that are huge references to specific bestiaries, to Aberdeen bestiary. But in terms of actual writing, I really wasn't looking at a ton of medieval writing, medieval narrative, really, because it felt like I don't want to imitate what somebody else is doing in their writing. I say that even though I constantly compare this thing to Gormenghast. In terms of like what actually happens, it's not inspired by a ton of medieval stuff. It's more like, well, what is this little person doing on the margins of this book?
That's interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of cool art, as you've just mentioned, and you have a background in illustration. And the world itself is beautifully built. It's sort of a large, sprawling, crumbling palace that sort of acts like a city. Could you talk about perhaps like, yeah, constructing the palace and how you visualize it? Because it's so visually evocative. And so I'm really curious about how like an illustration background can lend itself to like writing visually.
It doesn't actually help as much as you might think.
Thanks.
I very consciously didn't world build this, which is funny because people keep talking about the world building it, and I'm like, I don't know any more than what's on the page. I have some very specific notes to keep track of the chronology because the people refer to different eras. And I was like, well, okay, this era, the Apple era or whatever, they'll be like, this thing has been around since then. Like, this is the kind of thing that was happening then. And then the later eras have this thing happening, but not like I don't know the history. I don't know what's outside the walls. I don't know really what most of the people in it are up to because it's not world building so much as exploration. this sounds like such a cliche to say, but like I was discovering what was happening as the characters were. Like there's a moment where a character runs into somebody who's trying to teach apes to talk, and that wasn't part of the plan. It was just like, I guess we're doing this. Who is this guy? Why are there a bunch of monkeys? I don't know. We'll figure this out. So almost everything in there was just kind of happening on the fly. Like I guess this has to we need to get somewhere. So I guess we're gonna pull in some kind of big monstrous beast of burden that looks kind of like a human but isn't. I don't know. Let's go with that for a while and see what happens there. So yeah, the process was just constant discovery, which was a lot of fun. I recommend it if you can if you can use that process. It's a lot of fun.
That is super cool. Yeah, like that is distinct from world building. You're right. And it's interesting. And it's very authentically medieval in a way, because in the Middle Ages, people were walking around being like, some cool stuff happened before us, but we don't really know what a lot of it is.
Yeah.
They left some cool stuff here and some crumbling roads, you know, and that's like kind of where we are. So let's talk about the plot itself without giving too much away. The story begins with the death of the Guardian of the West Passage. So could you talk a little bit about how that sort of sends our two point of view characters on their journeys, Q and Pell, and maybe like the structure of their dual POVs?
The Guardian dies without passing her name and office on to Q, and he's like, "Well, this sucks. I'm her apprentice. I should have gotten that." And she has made him promise to warn the rulers of the palace over in Black Tower, that she made him promise to warn them that the beast is rising. We don't really know what the beast is for a long time, and I would say ever. I don't know if that's a spoiler or not. So he has to leave without being named. And names are a huge part of the world building here. We just said not really world building, but they're a huge aspect of the stories. Who gets a name and who doesn't, and what that means in the society and all that kind of thing. So he goes off begrudgingly to do this, and at the same time, Pell, who is sort of an apprentice in her own way to the women of Grey House, who are responsible theoretically for assisting at the birth and the death of everybody in the palace. In reality, it's like two people a year that they deal with. They are on their last legs. And a mysterious winter falls on the region that they live in. And she is like, I guess it's my job to put this right, and also head to Black Tower to do that. And they end up going in very different directions and encountering incredibly different people on the way. So yeah, the structure is just following them and whatever unexpected connections develop there, and what do they see? What do they learn? I've seen people refer to it as not having really a sense of urgency if things happen in fairy tale time. Like, now is the time when it's the monster appears. Now is the time when this happens. And it's like, yeah, I'm not interested in suspense.
Yeah, there is very much like a sort of fairy tale pacing, a lot of dream logic and sort of fairy tale type logic. Maybe that's why it feels like there's a lot of world building, because you're just living in it at a very comfy pace and really coming to inhabit it. But I'm curious about how that structure evolved when you are writing dual perspective. Like, do you write them in dialogue, or are they written separately and interwoven?
So I wrote them very separately. Initially, the book is divided into 8 smaller books. It was like the first book is Q and Pell, second book is like their title, Q and Pell, second book is Yarrow, second book is whatever. Initially, that structure was the first book is all Pell and eventually Yarrow. I don't think it's really a spoiler. It happens in the first few chapters where she becomes Yarrow. So it's all that. And so that meant that initially the first draft that went to my editor was 50 pages of women doing housework in a crumbling mansion, which I loved and I still love. And he thought was great. But he was like, we might need to get this moving a little faster. So he was like, let's kind of get other things happening at the same time, because all of it was already written. It was just separate. So we're kind of braiding them together. And I think that still, that impulse away from things happening is still evident, even though it moves more quickly now. So yeah, the process was just, okay, I've run out of steam with this character. We'll leave them in this point of something, maybe something about to happen, and then switch over until I get tired of that character, and then come back, and then maybe we'll fix it later.
Yeah, I really love stories that take their time like that. I'm reminded almost of, like, I'm not sure if you've seen it, the third season of Twin Peaks, where
Yes.
really
Yes.
take the time with the storytelling. Like, you just watch a guy spray paint shovels for 10 minutes, and that tells you something about the world. Like, it matters to the story, So I really love like a sort of relaxed pace where you can just come to live in the world.
Yeah, and I think the relaxed pace this was an unconscious impulse on my part, but I'm happy it happened, was that this setting is extremely moribund. It is the entire world is on death's door. Nobody has any urgency about anything except maybe the ladies, and what they think is urgent is not what everybody else thinks is urgent. So even these people who are on what they think are extremely important quests are like, it kind of doesn't matter if I get there or not, because nothing here is gonna matter.
Yeah, that was something that I thought a lot about too. Like it's a decaying city with crumbling infrastructure and administration. It feels very medieval in that way, but then in
Mhm.
other more upsetting ways feels very like now in the world that
Yes,
we live in right now.
which I swear wasn't intentional because, kind of like Tolkien, I really don't like straight up allegory. Like the beast that's rising isn't intentionally a metaphor for anything. If you want to read it that way, that's perfectly valid. I'm not going to stop anybody from doing that. But I didn't want to be like, okay, so the beast is climate change, and this thing is, I don't know, the Democratic Party, and this other thing is the Citizens United or whatever. It's not that kind of thing. But I was still writing it. 2019, climate change accelerating. I finished it at the beginning of the pandemic, so it is very much a book of 2020.
Yeah, feel that too, for sure.
Yeah.
So I'd love to talk a little bit more about what is sort of in your artistic DNA and what sort of influences you feel like shaped your writing of this book. We've talked about the medieval stuff too, but I'm also wondering about, again, the illustration background, because I feel like there's a lot of indie art and like indie comic vibes, like from the sort of past 10 to 15 or maybe 20 years of art in your, like how I visualize things in terms of like, comic pacing and storytelling and maybe like the sort of world building through visuals. Is that something
Mhm.
that you have dwelled in at all or feel like shapes your approach?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but that's absolutely true. I've been on the sort of periphery of the comic scene in Seattle for a long time, which is a lot of people like Jim Woodring, who is a fantastic artist and is like early Disney on
Yeah.
acid, and people like Ellen Forney, who does more autobiographical type stuff. But I actually took a class with her and TA'd for her once. Her approach is very not finding a shortcut is the wrong word or wrong phrase, but finding a way to represent something in a way that clarifies it without just explaining it. Like she talks about in her book Marbles, like how she represented something visually that would have, like, you could have done it literally and it probably would have been just fine, but it's so much more interesting if you do it this way. And I think I probably internalized that in different medium where there's a lot of stuff in the book where it's maybe important information and it's conveyed through like somebody kind of half looking at a book and not really understanding it. Like there's a not quite this an example of this, but one of my favorite parts in the book is somebody who the character Fryn, who was totally illiterate, looking at a book that if he could read would explain so much about what's going on, but he can't read, so he's looking at the pictures, and so the audience only sees what the pictures say. And I don't think you learn a ton from that, but you are directed to think along certain lines by it. And whether that has anything to do with the plot, I won't say. Might be a spoiler, but
Very cool. So, yeah, this has been absolutely lovely. And I really love talking about this book. I know it's sometimes difficult for authors to talk about what they are working on when it is in various phases of enforced silence. But what's on your horizon? What are you up to these days?
I'm trying to finish another book.
Nice.
Yeah, I comparing the two of them is like in a very specific way. I'm worried about repeating myself too much because the West Passage has a lot of themes of sacrifice and violence and cannibalism. I'm like, can I get away? Is that just what I do? So whatever the next one is will involve those things.
Cool. Good. That's excellent. I do enjoy those aspects, and it's great to know that those will still be around. So, thank you so much for coming to talk to us and sharing this book with me. I really loved it. I feel like it's going to have a lot of rereadability for me, like as a sort of medieval adjacent person. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. You're welcome.
Listeners, it's now your turn. Please check out The West Passage. It's absolutely beautiful, and I think you're really going to love it. By the time that you listen to this, it will be out in the world. So go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for those things. All right, it is now time to close this chapter. Goodbye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.